Prepare yourself for a journey through war and adventure. Follow Fitzroy Maclean as he takes you to the blazing deserts of North Africa. These are his words. Let's begin. After the kidnapping of General Zahedi, I settled down to the more orthodox task of assembling my new detachment and training them in SAS methods. As a training area, we were allotted Isfahan and the surrounding country, in the hope, I was told, that by showing the flag there, we might act as a deterrent to any other Persians who might be contemplating rebellion or cooperation with the Germans. Since there were only about 150 of us in total, with no other British troops for several hundred kilometers, it seemed doubtful whether we counted for much in the calculations of any potential fifth colonists. Nevertheless, we did our best with the material at our disposal to convey the impression that we were a large and well-equipped force. Sandy Scratchley and Bill Cumper brought over a load of high explosives and a convoy of fully fitted jeeps as a present from David Sterling. The unaccustomed sight of these nimble little vehicles, bristling with machine guns fore and aft, would, we hoped, strike terror into the hearts of General Zahedi's late accomplices. In addition to my original volunteers, Operation Pongo had brought me a number of Seaforths, including a piper, whose spirited performances were no doubt equally disconcerting to such Persians as heard them. Another valuable acquisition was Sergeant Charlie Button from Sandy Scratchley's regiment, the 4th County of London Yeomanry. Charlie was a rubicund and uniformly cheerful character, who after serving in the First World War and winning a military medal in the Western Desert during the Second, had now decided, upon reaching his late 40s, that it was time he learned to parachute. He was soon installed as quartermaster sergeant, and by the time we started our training program, he had accumulated a magnificent collection of weapons, equipment, vehicles, clothing, tents, and rations through methods that, while not strictly orthodox, were remarkably effective. We laid out an impressive camp about 30 kilometers from Isfahan, and the next 2 months were spent training arduously amidst the ice and snow of the hill country in southern Persia. Meanwhile, further west, the battles of El Alamein and Stalingrad had checked the German advance. By the end of 1942, it had become clear that the threat to Persia had been removed. I accordingly flew to Baghdad to try to find out what plans were being made for our future. Upon my arrival, I found General Wilson on the point of leaving for Cairo to take up the appointment of Commander-in-Chief, Middle East. This meant that the Eastern Mediterranean, an area with unrivaled opportunities for small-scale raiding, would come under his operational control. It was too good a chance to miss. Before he left, I extracted a promise from him that we should be transferred to Middle East Command immediately. With any luck, the training in mountain warfare we had acquired on the Iranian plateau would soon be put into practice amongst the hills and valleys of southern and eastern Europe. I took the first airplane back to Persia, and a week or two later, we struck camp and were moving as fast as our vehicles could carry us back across Persia and Iraq to our new scene of activities. In Middle East Command, there had been many changes since Duncan and I had set out for Persia in the autumn. 8th Army was now at the other end of North Africa, preparing for the landings in Sicily. The Middle East, long one of the only active theaters of war, was being converted into a gigantic jumping-off point and supply base for the invasion of southern Europe. In the SAS, there had also been changes. David Sterling, after many miraculous escapes, had at last been taken prisoner in Tunisia while operating hundreds of kilometers ahead of 8th Army. With the end of the war in the desert, too, the SAS had lost a medium ideally suited to their type of warfare. The desert had played a vital part in their operations. Now they would have to adapt to completely new conditions and methods if they were to achieve the same successes on the continent of Europe. I wished that David, so quick to grasp the potential of the desert for irregular warfare, had been there to help evolve a new continental technique. After David Sterling's capture, the SAS had split into several parts. Upon our arrival from Persia, my party joined up with George Jellicoe, who was training with canoes and rubber dinghies on the coast of Palestine at Otlit, romantically situated at the foot of Mount Carmel. There, the ruins of a vast Crusaders' castle, complete with dungeons and banqueting halls, towered above the blue waters and sandy beach of a small Mediterranean bay. After several weeks of this, I moved my detachment northward up the coast to Lebanon to complete our training in mountain warfare. For this purpose, we based ourselves in the village of Zala, high in the mountains behind Beirut. Situated in a typical Alpine valley, with a mountain stream rushing past its half-French provincial, half-Arab houses, Zala remains one of the most agreeable places I have visited. The locals use the stream to cool bottles of delicious wine from neighboring vineyards. However, by this time, we had grown tired of training, no matter how pleasant the surroundings might be. We had also grown tired of the Middle East. Our objective now was Europe, which had taken on a new allure due to its prolonged inaccessibility. 8th Army was preparing to land in Sicily, and we didn't see why we should be left behind. A few weeks after our arrival from Persia, I was summoned to Cairo and told to select a small party of officers and NCOs to attack a German fighter base on Crete. We were to be landed by night on a secluded part of the coast, make our way across the island to our target, blow up any aircraft there, and then return to the coast to be picked up again. We procured large-scale maps and aerial photographs and set about detailed planning. Soon, we felt as if we had known that airfield and the rocky gullies by which we would approach it since childhood. We drew our operational rations from Sergeant Button, discussing the relative merits of dates or raisins, biscuits or oatmeal, bully beef or bacon for long marches. We packed our explosives and cleaned our weapons meticulously. Just as we were preparing to leave for Beirut to board the motor launch that would drop us, I was summoned to Cairo once again, assuming it was for last-minute instructions. However, on arrival, I was informed that the latest aerial photographs showed the Germans were no longer using the airfield, and the operation was cancelled. I left GHQ feeling unjustifiably aggrieved. A year earlier, the Germans would never have behaved like this. In the desert, if you stayed around long enough, something always turned up. You didn't have to fabricate operations. In this frame of mind, I visited Rex Lipa, an old friend from my Foreign Office days, now His Majesty's ambassador to the Greek government in exile in Cairo. Reflecting on our early parachute training, I vaguely remembered mysterious figures passing through our hands, seemingly preparing to be dropped into enemy-occupied Greece, not to perform a single operation, but to remain indefinitely, just as Bob Mallow had lived for months behind enemy lines in the desert. A job like that seemed to fit my needs. Presumably, if one lived permanently in enemy-occupied territory, one wouldn't need to go out of one's way to find excitement. I found the ambassador in his pleasant flat in Zamalek, overlooking the grounds of the Jazeera Sporting Club, with a long drink waiting for me, most welcome after a frustrating morning in the sweltering offices of GHQ. Better still, he assured me there was every prospect of a job along the lines I had in mind. He promised to make inquiries and let me know the result. Blessed with a lively imagination, I returned in better spirits, already picturing myself in various fascinating and spectacular situations among the time-scented mountains of Greece. Upon my return, I asked Duncan and Sergeant Button whether they would like to join me in Greece. They said they didn't mind if they did. The response to Rex Lipa's inquiries came sooner than expected. No sooner had I returned to Zala than I received a message asking me to return to Cairo immediately. Upon my arrival, Lipa showed me a telegram from London stating that I was needed, not in Greece, but in Yugoslavia. I was to be dropped there by parachute. I was to fly to London immediately and report directly to the Prime Minister, who would explain what was required. I had little time to reflect on the implications of this telegram. An airplane was leaving for England that same night. There was barely enough time to notify GHQ and obtain the necessary movement orders. Having not been home in nearly 2 years, the thought of returning was excitement enough in itself. I knew little of the situation in Yugoslavia. I had never been there before the war, and since the German occupation, the only news of Yugoslavia I remembered reading, in the occasional copies of the Egyptian mail that had come my way, concerned General Mihailovic, who was reportedly conducting a spirited resistance movement in the mountains. If I speculated at all about the future, I guessed I would somehow be involved with this legendary figure. Once I reached London, I was quickly brought up to speed. Information reaching the British government from various sources had cast doubt on General Mihailovic and his Chetnik's level of resistance to the enemy. There were indications that as much, if not more, was being done by armed groups called partisans, led by a shadowy figure known as Tito. Until now, all our support had gone exclusively to Mihailovic, but doubts about the wisdom of this policy were beginning to creep in. My task was to assess the partisans' contribution to the Allied cause and determine how best to assist them. For this, I was to be dropped into Yugoslavia as the head of a military mission accredited to Tito, or whoever I found in command of the partisans. My inquiries revealed little was known about the partisans in Whitehall. 3 or 4 British officers had been parachuted into them a few weeks before, but fierce fighting in Yugoslavia since their arrival had prevented any comprehensive report from reaching London. It was believed the partisans were under communist leadership and causing considerable inconvenience to the Germans, based on German sources. Their main area of activity was thought to be Bosnia, and it was there I was to be dropped. As for Tito, theories about his identity abounded. Some thought he didn't exist, asserting that Tito stood for Tajna Internationalna Terroristica Organizacija, secret international terrorist organization, not an individual leader. Others believed Tito was a title, with a new one appointed regularly. The romantically inclined suggested Tito was a young woman of striking beauty and great force of character. A day or two after I arrived in England, I received a call from number 10 Downing Street. Mr. Churchill wanted me to spend the weekend at Chequers so he could personally explain what he had in mind. When I reached Chequers, I wondered if the Prime Minister would ever find time to talk to me about Yugoslavia. The Chief of the Imperial General Staff was there, Air Marshal Harris of Bomber Command, an American general, and an expert on landing craft, along with a number of other people, all of whom clearly had matters of utmost importance to discuss with Mr. Churchill. Red leather dispatch boxes, full of telegrams and signals from every theatre of war, kept arriving by dispatch riders from London. Then there were the films, long films, short films, comic films, and serious films, shown at all hours of the day and night. The great men stood by, waiting their turn, hoping it would not come in the early hours of the morning, a time when most people do not feel their brightest, especially after seeing 3 or 4 films in succession, while the Prime Minister, on the contrary, seemed filled with renewed vigor of mind and body. Towards midnight, in the middle of a Mickey Mouse cartoon, a memorable interruption occurred. A message was brought to Mr. Churchill, who gave an exclamation of surprise. There was a brief scuffle, and the film was stopped. As the squawking of Donald Duck and the baying of Pluto died away, the Prime Minister rose to his feet. "I have just," he said, "received some very important news. Signor Mussolini has resigned." The film was then switched back on. As we went downstairs, I reflected that, in light of this startling new development, it seemed more unlikely than ever that the Prime Minister would find time to attend to my affairs. But I was mistaken. "This," he said, turning to me, "makes your job more important than ever. The German position in Italy is crumbling. We must now put all the pressure we can on them from the other side of the Adriatic. You must go in without delay." Mr. Churchill then gave me a splendidly lucid and vivid account of the strategic situation and what he wanted me to try and accomplish in Yugoslavia. I was amazed, as I often was afterward, by his extraordinary grasp of detail regarding what was, after all, only one of the innumerable problems confronting him. After he had finished, there was one point that still required clarification in my mind. The years I had spent in the Soviet Union had left me deeply and lastingly conscious of the expansionist tendencies of international communism and its intimate connection with Soviet foreign policy. After all, in my day, the Communist International had displayed a brass plate in one of Moscow's main thoroughfares, and had included Stalin and several other leading Soviet public figures among the members of its executive committee. If, as I had been told, the partisans were under communist leadership, they might indeed be fighting very well for the Allied cause. However, their ultimate aim would undoubtedly be to establish a communist regime in Yugoslavia, closely linked to Moscow. How did His Majesty's government view such an eventuality? Was it, at this stage, their policy to obstruct Soviet expansion in the Balkans? If so, my task looked like it would be a tricky one. Mr. Churchill's reply left no doubt as to the answer to my question. "So long," he said, "as all of Western civilization was threatened by the Nazi menace, we could not afford to divert our attention from the immediate issue by considerations of long-term policy. We were as loyal to our Soviet allies as we hoped they were to us. My task was simply to find out who was killing the most Germans and suggest ways to help them kill more. Politics," he said, "must be a secondary consideration." I was relieved by this. Although, as a conservative, I had no liking for communists or communism, I had not relished the idea of having to intrigue politically against men with whom I was cooperating militarily. Now, in light of what the Prime Minister had told me, my position was clear. Meanwhile, the first thing was to refresh my knowledge of the country I was bound for. While I was in England, I read every book about Yugoslavia that I could get my hands on. Seen from the perspective of someone about to plunge headlong into it, the turbulent stream of Balkan history took on a new fascination. The details were as confusing as ever, but certain basic characteristics, certain constantly recurring themes, seemed to run through the bewildering succession of war, rebellion, heroism, treachery, and intrigue. In these, I thought, might lie the key to much of what was happening now. I would be among Slavs once more. 15 centuries ago, the ancestors of the principal races that now inhabit Yugoslavia, the Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Montenegrins, and others, had migrated there from the north to become a southern outpost of the Slavic world. They were Yugoslavs, South Slavs. Their language, Serbo-Croat, had much in common with Russian, and soon I found I could understand it and make myself understood in it. Their history had been eventful from the start, a tale of bloodshed and violence, of feudal lords contending for supremacy within their own country, and of overlords, once their supremacy was established, striving to impose their rule on neighboring races and countries. They sought to forge an empire strong enough to hold its own in the rapidly shrinking power vacuum between East and West. To overthrow each other, rid themselves of dangerous rivals, and settle their internal quarrels, these Balkan chieftains would enlist the help of outside powers, Byzantium, the Turks, the Emperor, or the Pope. Then, they would unite once more to cast off the foreign allegiance they had previously accepted. Above all, they mastered the art of playing off the great powers against one another, East against West, Rome against Byzantium, Pope against Emperor, Teuton against Turk. The purpose of these maneuvers remained the same, the preservation of their national independence. They pursued this goal with a unique blend of violence, devotion, turbulence, and resilience. For small national states, survival was, and still is, a hard struggle. The westward advance of the Osmanli Turks grew harder to resist. In 1389, at Kosovo, the famous Field of the Blackbirds, the Serbian Prince Lazar was killed, and his people passed under Turkish domination. Neighboring principalities fell one by one, and soon the entire peninsula was under foreign rule, the Turks in the south and east, the Austrians and Hungarians advancing from the west and north, and the Venetians establishing themselves along the coast. This situation lasted for over 3 centuries. In this way, the South Slavs were divided. The southern and eastern parts of their territory, now Serbia, came under Turkish rule, while the northern and western areas, now Croatia and Slovenia, fell under Austro-Hungarian control. The Dalmatian coastal strip was taken by the Doges of Venice, until eventually, with the decline of Venice, it too was absorbed by Austria-Hungary. Although their language and racial origins were identical, the two groups of Slavs found themselves separated by the national frontiers of the great powers, gradually growing apart culturally, politically, and traditionally. This division was further cemented by religion, as the split between the Eastern and Western churches, Orthodox and Catholic, crystallized into a fixed pattern. The results of this cleavage are still felt today. Under the loose, often savage rule of the sultans, the Serbs, while enjoying a certain degree of liberty and even autonomy, inevitably looked to Constantinople as the political, religious, and cultural center of their world. For them, the church was the Eastern Orthodox Church, with the Patriarch of Constantinople at its head. Some, particularly in Bosnia, even converted to the faith of their conquerors and embraced Islam. The Croats and Slovenes, on the other hand, looked westward toward Vienna, their upper classes basking at a respectful distance in the reflected glory of the imperial court. In religion, they were Roman Catholics, like their Austrian masters, having largely received Christianity with the Teutonic invaders from the north. Culturally, politically, and in their outlook on life, they became a Western rather than an Eastern people. Under Turkish rule, the Serbs made little progress toward the kind of civilization that existed in Western Europe. As administrators, the Turks were not greatly concerned with culture. In the outlying provinces of their empire, their main preoccupations were financial and military, the levying of tribute and the defense of their frontiers. While Zagreb grew to resemble a European town, Belgrade remained an Oriental fortress. Yet, in one respect, the Serbs did not lag behind their Slav brothers beyond the frontier. They never lost their love of freedom or their sense of nationhood. Throughout the centuries of Turkish rule, the spirit of independence was kept alive in the hill country of Serbia by small bands of guerrilla fighters who harried the Turks, partly for the fun of it and partly to keep alive a nucleus, however small, of national independence. The Montenegrins were particularly successful, holding out in their mountains, unsubdued, for centuries. This tradition of resistance endured both in Serbia and Montenegro. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire began to crumble. The spirit of liberty and national independence sweeping through Europe found fertile ground in the Balkans. For the first time, progressive elements in Europe, following the example of Lord Byron, took an interest in the fate of the Balkan Christians. The Russians, sharing ties of race, language, and religion with the Serbs, championed the pan-Slavic movement. Suddenly, the patriots of the Balkans found powerful friends. In Serbia, they also had effective leaders. In 1804, the Serbian revolt against the Turks was led by Karađorđe, Black George, a peasant-turned-mercenary, brigand, and guerrilla leader. Karađorđe, who would become the founder of the Karađorđević dynasty, was a swarthy, savage, and morose figure. It is said he killed over 100 men with his own hands, including his father and brother. He was a determined man and an effective commander in the field, although he proved a forceful rather than a skillful statesman. By 1807, Karađorđe had driven the Turks from Serbia. In 1809, they returned. With Russian help, he drove them out again. But in 1813, the Turks returned once more, this time in overwhelming force, and Karađorđe was driven into exile, first in Austria and then in Russia. The Turks appointed Miloš Obrenović, a former herdsman, to rule the conquered province for them. However, in 1815, there was another rising against the Turks, this time led by Miloš Obrenović himself. He, too, proved to be a man of determination, and in a single campaign expelled the Turks and proclaimed himself Prince of Serbia. Afterward, he obtained Turkish recognition and, in return, accepted Turkish suzerainty. When Karađorđe returned in 1817, he was assassinated, and his head was sent to the Turks. It was thought that Miloš Obrenović had not been entirely unconnected with the assassination. For the next 100 years, Serbia presents an extraordinary picture of intrigue and unrest. Rival dynasties, founded by the two peasant liberators, Karađorđe and Miloš Obrenović, served as rallying points for opposing factions. Princes and kings, prime ministers and commanders-in-chief, followed one another in a bewildering succession, regulated by mob violence, political assassination, and the intrigues of the great powers. In her external relations, Serbia sided first with one great power and then with another, as her interests or the personal inclinations of her rulers demanded. The great powers, for their part, lent their support first to one Serbian faction and then to another. Seen from close up, these proceedings are far from edifying. But, regarded in light of later events, they fall into their proper place as incidents in the struggle of a proud and naturally turbulent people for unity and nationhood. For that was the ultimate aim, the reunion with Serbia of the Croat, Slovene, Dalmatian, Bosnian, and other provinces still under Austro-Hungarian or Turkish rule, and the maintenance, by judicious maneuvering, of Serbia's independence in relation to the great powers. With Karađorđe out of the way, and with Russia supporting him, Miloš Obrenović reigned as prince of a semi-autonomous Serbia under Turkish suzerainty until 1839. The ferocity of his despotism equaled that of the Turks. In 1839, he was ousted by his own son, Milan. However, Milan died the same year and was succeeded by his brother, Michael. Michael, in turn, was dethroned 2 years later by Alexander Karađorđević, the son of Karađorđe, who enjoyed the support of Austria-Hungary and Turkey. The Obrenovićs went into exile. But Serbia had not seen the last of the Obrenović dynasty, nor of its founder, Miloš. Alexander's policy of friendship with Austria was unpopular, especially with the Tsar, who regarded himself as the protector of Serbia. In 1859 Alexander was driven out, and after 20 years of exile, that aged but persistent herdsman, Miloš Obrenović, returned to the throne from which he had been driven by his son 2 decades earlier. He, for one, knew the value of friendship with Russia. In less than 2 years, Miloš Obrenović was dead, succeeded by his son Michael, who also returned from exile and ruled wisely until 1868, when he was assassinated. It was thought the Karađorđe faction was not entirely unconnected with his demise. However, this time there was no change of dynasty. The Karađorđe plot misfired, and Michael Obrenović was succeeded as prince by his cousin Milan. Under Milan Obrenović, Serbia embarked on a more adventurous policy, engaging in or joining no fewer than 3 wars. In 1876, having attacked the Turks, she was defeated, and her autonomy seemed in jeopardy. However, Russia came to the rescue, and Serbia then joined Russia in their war of 1877-78 against Turkey. As a reward, Serbia was granted complete independence from Turkey, and Milan was proclaimed king. Even so, Milan felt that Russia had not done enough for him and, abandoning the traditional pro-Russian policy of his dynasty, turned toward Austria. In 1885, the Serbs were defeated by their neighbors, the Bulgarians, who now, in their turn, enjoyed the favor of the Russians. Once again, it was Austria that came to Serbia's aid. Leaning heavily towards Austria, Milan continued to reign until 1889, when, following his divorce from his Russian wife, Natalie, he unexpectedly abdicated in favor of his young son, Alexander. With Milan's departure, Serbia swung back toward Russia once more. The young Alexander, however, soon found himself in difficulties and recalled his father, the ex-king, from exile to advise him, making him commander-in-chief of the Serbian army. With Milan's return, Serbia inclined once more toward Austria-Hungary, that is, until Alexander fell in love with and married Draga, one of his Russian mother's ladies-in-waiting. He then exiled his father once more and threw Serbia back into the arms of Russia. By this time, Alexander Obrenović was popular neither with the great powers nor with his own subjects. Plots, disturbances, and conspiracies became the order of the day. He considered changing his foreign policy or even divorcing his wife, but he was not quick enough. On June 15, 1903, both he and Queen Draga were assassinated, and their horribly mutilated bodies were thrown from the window of their ornate little palace. It was generally supposed that the supporters of the rival dynasty had been involved in the assassination. At any rate, it was Peter Karađorđević, the grandson of Karađorđe, who now ascended the throne, while the Ministry of Public Works, a lucrative position, went to a certain Colonel Massin, known to have played a key role in the assassination. He was also, as it happened, the brother-in-law of the murdered queen but had evidently not allowed family ties to interfere with his political convictions. The first act of the new parliament was to pass a vote of thanks to the regicides, and the Russian ambassador was among the first to congratulate King Peter on his accession to the throne. Russian influence was on the rise. That concludes the 7th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.